everybody. Welcome back from lunch. Thanks so much for being back. We are now going to move to our webinar called Other Considerations. We will be hearing from Elise LeConte on repository agreements, then Laura Capel on digitization, and Ann McCudden on integrating collections policies into day-to-day work. I'm going to do the introductions now because I think it's just easier, and then we'll let we're going to save the questions till the end. So if you've got questions, if you can save them till after these three presentations, and I'm very grateful to our speakers. We've asked them to cover their topics in 10 minutes, and this is another case where an hour would not have been sufficient, and so they're going to give you just a quick overview. So we're going to start with Elise LeConte, and I'm turning the microphone over to Elise.
Thank you, Miriam. Now let me get the slides started here. Okay. Some cultural institutions, like museums and libraries, act as repositories for outside groups or agencies, which means that they agree to accept and care for collections that belong to another institution. For example, a government agency might make an agreement with a museum to care for collections that come from federal lands or that are seized for illegal importation. A city government might wish to store its historical archives at a university library where they can be better cared for. In these cases, a binding agreement needs to be struck between the outside agency and the institution that will be taking the collection in. A repository can be any facility, such as a museum, archive, historical society, university, college, or other educational or scientific institution that can provide professional and accountable curatorial services on a long-term basis. Examples of depositing institutions include federal, state, or local government agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Park Service, or institutions like tribal entities and historical societies. Private individuals are not suitable as repositories or depositors. A repository agreement is a written document describing a cooperative partnership between an institution or agency that owns a collection and another institution or agency that can better care for and manage that collection. Simply put, one institution takes on custodial responsibility for the care and management of a collection owned by another institution. It is important to note that legal ownership of the collection is not transferred to the repository. In certain cases, an institution may not wish to or may not be allowed to relinquish legal ownership of a collection. For example, because federal agencies exist to serve U.S. citizens, no federal agency can legally transfer ownership of a collection to another institution. Despite the fact that an institution does not or cannot transfer ownership, it may still wish to deposit a collection with another facility for a number of reasons. For example, the conditions of the repository's facilities meet archival quality standards, such as proper environmental, light, and pest control. And it has archival quality storage housing and professionally trained collection staff. Access to the collection for research, exhibits, and educational programming may also be easier and better regulated at the repository. A repository may wish to take custody of a collection because the collection fits its mission and scope of collections, it is a collection worthy of long-term preservation, and it will enhance the research, exhibit, and educational value of the repository's own collections. There are two other types of repository agreements that museums and archives sometimes use: a Memorandum of Agreement, or MOA, and a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU. In the business world, there are slight variations in the definitions of a repository agreement versus a Memorandum of Agreement versus a Memorandum of Understanding. However, for our purposes, museums, libraries, and other cultural repositories use the terms interchangeably. Repository agreements can be simple or complex. The components of a repository agreement, MOA or MOU, should include the following. First, we have the purpose of the agreement. This section contains information such as the name of the institution or agencies involved, a description of the collection, a brief description of the scope of work, the financial obligations of, if any, of each institution, and the dates the agreement will be in effect. Next, we have the detailed description of the roles and responsibilities, required standards and procedures, and any special instructions or restrictions. This section should spell out the minimum standards for the collection storage environment, containers, storage furniture, and any other collection management standards that are required by the owner to care for and manage the collection. For example, the National Park Service requires that a repository meet the standards set forth in the Federal Regulations 36 CFR Part 79, Curation of Federally Owned and Administered Archaeological Collections. This section should list any special procedures and restrictions for handling, storing, inspecting, inventorying, cleaning, conserving, and exhibiting the collection. Also, any restrictions for access and use, including instructions for restricting access to confidential information like donor information or location of a field site. Other restrictions might stipulate that the collections are to be studied on site but not loaned. If available for loan, it should tell that the fact that loans must be approved by the agency that owns the collection. And things like whether sampling for destructive testing is allowed and under what conditions. The agreement should give instructions for providing copies of publications, data, or digital resources generated as a result of research or use of the collection. It should lay out the required staffing, that is the number of staff, position titles, and level of professional training, and which party is responsible for the initial processing of the collection, including cataloging and housing, and for packing up and returning the collection when the agreement is terminated. It should include a statement that restricts the repository from transferring, repatriating, or discarding the collection, as well as a statement that the agreement must be consistent with applicable laws, regulations, and policies of both institutions. Another component is a payment schedule, if applicable. This section details the amount of funding, if any, and the timing of the payment. It should list the fees to be paid to the curating institution for services provided like storing, inventorying, maintaining, and conserving the collection. These are often called curation fees. It should also say which party is responsible for paying the initial processing of the collection, as well as for the costs involved in returning the collection when the agreement is terminated. Another component lays out the duration of the agreement. This segment identifies the effective date of the agreement, its term, if there is one. For example, the National Park Service uses 20 or 25 years depending on the conditions of the agreement, and how the agreement can be modified, extended, or terminated. Lastly, the agreement should have a section for the signatures of the authorized representatives. This section includes the names and signatures of the officials from each institution who are authorized to approve agreements on the institution's behalf. This might be a board chair, director, or a superintendent. The section also includes the date the agreement is signed. Then each institution gets a signed original for its files. Criteria for accepting a collection under a repository agreement should be the same as those for accepting a donation. The collection should fall within the repository's mission, fit within the repository's scope of collections, and complement the repository's research, exhibits, and programming. In addition, the repository must have the resources necessary to care for and manage the collection according to professional standards and best practices. If acceptable to the depositing institution, the repository may establish a record-keeping system that parallels its accessioning system in order to keep track of the collection. The repository may assign accession numbers and catalog numbers that mimic its own system. It may enter and track data about the collection in its collections management database in the same way that it enters and tracks data about its own collections. The caveat is that it always remains clear that the repository is merely the custodian of the collection, while the depositing institution remains the legal owner of the collection. This is an example of a repository agreement between the Florida Museum of Natural History and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It is a very simple agreement, but it does cover the basics. The collection consists of Amazonian indigenous artifacts that were illegally imported into the U.S. and were confiscated in a sting. You can see that the agreement identifies the owner of the collection, that is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the repository, which is the Florida Museum of Natural History, the conditions of the quote-unquote donation, not to sell, barter, or trade the objects, and that the museum must use the collection to help educate the public about illegal trafficking in indigenous culture. The agreement is also signed by the authorized representatives from both organizations. Note that the museum's director is the only person from the museum that is authorized to sign such an agreement. I also want to point out that even though the words transfer and donation are used in the agreement, it is still not a legal transfer of ownership to the museum. The agreement also contains a detailed description of the collection in an attached 22-page inventory. And these are some of the resources that I used in my presentation, and I will put these on the online community. I'd now like to hand it over to Laura Capel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give you a very quick whirlwind tour of digital collection development and planning in order to help design successful digital projects. Digital projects come in all shapes and sizes. The nature and workflow of projects can differ considerably from place to place because there's no one-size-fits-all approach. But successful projects share some common elements, and they share the common goal of increasing access to collections. Having a digital collection development policy can guide you as you plan and carry out projects by setting parameters and helping to ensure consistency. Today I'm going to talk about a few things to keep in mind for developing policies and designing digital projects, including planning, workflows, standards, and access. As I'm sure you're aware, it's not realistic to digitize everything in our collections. So digital collection development is critical to help us focus limited resources to achieve our desired impact. It takes a lot of time, effort, and money to plan and implement successful digital projects. But through careful collection development, you can create meaningful and highly relevant digital collections. It's really helpful to have a digital collection development policy that can create a sense of focus and cohesion. It also helps to make sure that your projects are in line with your institution's mission, and it takes into consideration issues such as copyright, preservation, use, audience, and research value. Selecting what to digitize can be handled in a variety of different ways and can be driven by different factors, such as high use, donor relations, or even highlighting hidden gems that are in your collections. Good planning is also important for successful digital projects because what you do here sets the foundation for everything that follows. This is where you pull all of the stakeholders together, create a vision of what you want to accomplish, set priorities, and outline the steps you have to take to get there. There's no set formula for the planning process, and often it can vary from project to project, but it still needs to be there. I do suggest documenting your planning process, either in your digital collection development policy or in a separate planning document, just as a way to codify the process. There's a lot of questions to consider before you start to digitize a collection, and some of them include, what do you want to digitize? Why do you want to digitize it? How will you do the work? Will it be in-house or will you outsource it? What is the existing arrangement and description of the materials? Are there any rights issues? What's the physical condition? What standards will you use for digitization and for metadata? How will the digital images be preserved? How will you provide access? What steps are involved? What's the timeline? Who will do the work? What are the costs? And how will you pay for it? It's a lot to consider, But if you don't address these questions at the start, you can really run into headaches down the line. No matter the size or scope of your project, there are a variety of good tools out there that can help guide you through the process. I've listed a couple here up on the screen that are really helpful. And I don't have time to go into all of them right now, but they're all very well established, recognized resources with lots of good information about planning and implementing digital projects. They're all available online, and I really encourage you to look through them. Rights management, as we talked about earlier, is especially important to consider and should definitely be addressed in your digital collection development policy. Although it can be a headache, it really isn't something you can ignore, and it's best to consider before starting a project. Ideally, you want to select materials that are in the public domain or where the copyright holder is given permission. But it's not always very straightforward because sometimes you may not know who the rights holder is. Also, it's important to document the copyright status and the rationale behind the decisions you make so that if an issue comes up years down the road, you have something to go back to. There are two good resources about rights management for digital projects up on the screen, and I definitely recommend checking them out. I want to mention again that there's no one-size-fits-all approach for digital projects, and I'll give you several examples of how the process can unfold based on my experience at different institutions. My first digital projects were at the University of Hawaii, where I was a project archivist. As I processed collections, I found good candidates for digitization. Digital initiatives were very decentralized, and I played the role of archivist, digitizer, and metadata creator. Coming up with a project plan and carrying it out was up to me, and I just pulled in the appropriate parties as necessary. For example, I would work with the preservation staff to stabilize damaged materials to scan them, or I worked with IT to make the materials available online. The planning and workflow were very informal, but it really worked out well for these ad hoc projects. Planning at the University of Miami, on the other hand, is much more formal and structured. There are a lot of people involved, including all of our curators, scanning, metadata, preservation, and digital repository staff. As the project manager, my job is to oversee the planning, coordinate between all of the parties involved, and make sure everything goes smoothly as projects move through the workflow. The projects originate from 6 different departments of our library, and we can have upwards of 20 different digital projects going on at once, ranging from a small box of photos to audio and video or mass digitization of hundreds of boxes. We have a project cycle that's based on our semester system, and each semester the curators will submit a list of proposed projects. I then set up meetings so that the entire digital team and preservation can meet with the curators to review the projects and identify any potential issues. We also have a digital collection strategies committee made up of representatives from across the library who review all of the projects to make sure they fit the parameters of our digital collection development policy. And then once the projects enter our digital queue, preservation does any necessary repairs, and then the materials are sent to our digital lab for scanning. And afterwards, they're uploaded into Content DM, and we create all of our metadata, and then do one big final review before making everything available online. There's really no right or wrong approach to digitization. You just really have to see what works best for your particular situation. Now I'm going to move quickly through digital standards and best practices. As you plan your projects, you need to keep in mind what standards you want to follow. And there are a variety of options depending on the format, your desired outcome, and your resources, such as the amount of storage space you have. Images, text, and audio all have well-accepted standards, but video is still a little bit like the Wild West because accepted best practices are still emerging. One good place to go for recommendations on standards is the California Digital Library's Digital File Format Recommendations document that I have listed up on the screen. Another good resource to check out is the Still Image Working Group's Technical Guidelines for Digitizing Cultural Heritage Materials. This is, the full title is up on the screen, and it's quite long, but this is really an excellent resource to check out. It's very comprehensive, and it has lots of good technical information about digitizing a wide variety of photographs and film, as well as documents, maps, and objects. And one thing that they do a nice job of is they'll give you the recommended optimal standard to scan at, but they'll also give you acceptable alternatives. And while it's best to use the optimal standard if possible, you may decide that the alternative minimum is a better fit for your project based on your goals and your resources. Access is also something you need to consider in your policies and planning. For example, you need to decide if your digital content will be publicly accessible online, or if access will be limited to your reading room due to things like copyright restrictions. We've had audio collections that we've digitized for preservation purposes that we can't make publicly available online, so we've restricted the access to our reading room. You also need to consider what type of access images you want to provide to the documents and photographs that you scan. The format, resolution, quality, and delivery method that you use largely depend on factors such as the system you're using to make your content available and the level of access you want to provide. Depending on the nature of the project, many institutions provide lower resolution access images, although for items in the public domain, some places allow you to download high-quality access images from their website. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, so this is why having policies in place can be really helpful. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, and there's a lot to consider to design successful digital projects. But it really comes down to policies and good planning, because this is where you define your project, determine the appropriate standards, and map out your workflow. Each institution has its own approach to digitization based on its organization, resources, and goals, but there are a lot of good resources to guide you, as well as people who are more than happy to talk with you and share their experiences and ideas. Digital projects don't have to be designed and implemented in isolation, because after all, we're all here to share the same common goal of providing increased access to our collections. Now I'm going to turn over the mic so that Anne can come on.
Thank you, Laura. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm just going to advance the slides here. I'm just going to talk to you briefly on the day-to-day use of a collections policy. And I know that this is a little bit more of the mundane information, but it is important for you to this is sort of the administrative use of your collections policy. And it's necessary to institutionalize your document so that you can really ingrain in the staff's mindset what it entails so that it can become part of your administrative culture. So let me get to the first slide here. The first thing I want to talk about was staff buy-in and compliance. And I think it's important that you include all the staff all the time. And I say that because a lot of times people want to focus on who wrote a certain policy or plan, or when it was written, or whether previous staff wrote it, or things along those lines. And that's really something that you want to get away from, and make sure that everybody is included as part of the plan and they understand what it's about, regardless of who wrote it or when it was originally created. Some institutions have plans that go back many years, and they're going to get updated, so it's just important to keep it at the front of everybody's minds. I also think this should be instituted as one of the core documents. I say core documents in quotes because obviously it's one of AAM's core documents, but regardless of whether you've gone down that path, you should still consider it one of your core documents. I'm not saying that any core document is better than any other one, because there's always a lot of conversations that go around about that. But obviously the collections policy is one of the core documents, obviously if you're a collecting institution. I also think it's important to pinpoint which parts will need to be strictly adhered to by all staff and which parts won't. I mentioned donations and deaccessions and personal collecting just as an example. There's obviously could be other sections that would be relevant to all staff, but certainly donations and come up in terms of all staff needing to know how that process works. And deaccessions and personal collecting could as well. But look at those areas that you think all staff are going to need to focus on so that you can teach them accordingly. And of course, as I know other people have mentioned, tying this policy back to your long-range plan and your budgeting is important. One of the three does not necessarily drive the other. They sort of all need to work in tandem. In my opinion, if you're having a discussion about your collection policy or your long-range plan or your budgeting or those sorts of things, you should instinctively or almost automatically be having conversations about the other documents, because they really should and do play into each other. Next thing I wanted to talk about was ownership. I think it's important to assign ownership at various parts of the document by position and not person, because as we all know, people change institutions or change job titles and things like that. So you want to sort of make sure you write this from the perspective that the people coming down the road can understand that, let's say, the registrar does this as opposed to, Anne does this. So that's important. I also think it's important to institute basic across-the-board knowledge of the document for all new staff. But in my next point, I want to point out that I think you should roll out, as we all are in this process now of writing this document, so it's either a revised or a new document. I think it's important that you roll it out or introduce it or whatever you want to call it to new staff differently than you would staff who have been around while you're writing it and while you're working on it. And the reason I say that is because you want to continue on that vein of buy-in for the people who've been around. Whether they've helped write it or not, I think you should sort of introduce it to them a little differently to instill in them that this is something that they did help with and that it's part of them. And then new staff, of course, would be part of an orientation process. And of course, part of ownership comes with physical ownership, and that you keep physical copies, although you will have digital copies, I'm sure, as well. Physical copies as part of whatever you keep your other standard operating procedures and emergency plans and things like that, staff contact information, to obviously make sure that you have a physical copy of this along with those things. Again, we're just instituting that administrative knowledge and getting people used to the fact that this is indeed a core document. Next thing I wanted to talk about briefly was training, and I do think it's important that you structure the training so that it's sort of segmented or layered or however you want to look at it. I know this is not possible for everybody depending on time and staff size, but I still think even if you have a staff of 2 or 3 or 4, that you try to segment it out as much as possible. Gives a little more to the training, and the person can feel a little bit like they got that personal training. I think the collection staff, obviously, being most likely the authors and the people that really worked on this document closely, should get 3 to 4 training experiences in a year. I mean, they're going to be inundated. They're going to be around this thing daily, but still, 3 to 4 structured training experiences in a year. I think and again, these names could change. Operations for you might be facilities, but your operations, security, maintenance type of people should do a training. Perhaps you always do more than I suggest in this slide, but at least once a year in conjunction with emergency training that they're doing. Not that you're training on 2 things at once. I don't mean that. I mean that while they're doing their training in whatever capacity it is, you mention or tie in the collection policy to sort of show them, you see how these 2 things interact. Same thing with the education or interpretation folks. A good way to do this might be as part of a new exhibit or as a new program starts. So they're learning the content of that, but at the same time they could be learning how the collection policy plays into what their job is. And then I also think that the frontline staff and this, tour guides or cashiers or people answering the phone, all those people, that they should probably just focus on the relevant areas so we don't overwhelm them too much. And I don't mean that in an intellectual capacity. I mean they've got a lot of other things to do. And then volunteers, I think it would just depend on what their assigned tasks are, whether you would even introduce it to them beyond a cursory glance, because it could take up a lot of their time and energy. I am watching my clock, so I'll stay within my 10 minutes here. Types of training, there are just no end to the types of training, of course, that you can do, and this is where the creativity comes in. So for those of you that design curriculums and do that sort of thing, this is a good chance to sort of go crazy. But I do think I do put tabletop at the top to point out that I think those are quite beneficial types of training. These are literal hands-on exercises, role-playing scenarios, small groups where you sit at a table and obviously go through an actual scenario that's going to happen that you use the collection policy for. I say test. Don't worry, quotes. Again, I put it in quotes because it's not a verbal. There's nothing punitive about it. But sometimes you can just incorporate this into a staff discussion or a staff meeting where you can even make it competitive. I know there's lots of competitive people out there who like to sort of see how well they can do and just sort of tap them on their different parts of the policy and see if they sort of remember what things are about. And then, of course, as the collection policy is being rewritten or edited or updated, that's a form of training too. And I just say here to be careful, though, that when this rewriting and editing and updating takes place, that you not end up with too many voices. I was talking to somebody the other day that was reading something, and they said it felt like 4 people had written it. And I was like, well, yeah, 4 people did write it. So you have to be careful about that. It's a good training opportunity, but you want to make sure it ends up sounding like one voice after you've edited. A couple other training types are, I think that the collection staff are going to be the best source for coming up with what you should be trained on, because they're going to know what the pressing and current issues are. They're going to run into those things most frequently. So go to the collection staff and say, what do you think some of the things are that you should focus on in terms of the collection policy? Because remember, you're not going to teach everybody everything. And then while you're training, use it as an opportunity to reinforce assigned duties as they're laid out in the policy. Who's supposed to do what, to sort of sneak that in there. Do an exercise that points out who's supposed to do what. Somebody might learn sort of 2 things at once.
because those roles are very important as you want to ingrain those in people as well. Review and evaluation, absolutely set a schedule to review. Do not be afraid to assign dates, and a lot of people are worried that if they set a date and they miss it, something's going to happen. Well, nothing's going to happen because it's your date. But if you don't set a date, I assure you, you will never review it. So, arbitrary as it is, pick a date, and barring, obviously, major issues that come up, stick with it. And I think the collection staff probably are doing this naturally, but if they're not, encourage them to maintain a sort of parking lot or a standing list of issues and changes and concerns with the document, whether they be minor editorial changes or major ones, so that when you get to this review period, you're not sort of starting from scratch. And then the minor changes and edits, of course, I think goes without saying that you don't need official approval for those, and you don't need to actually update that as you go. You could save that for a once-a-year time when you're doing reviewing. A little bit more about reviewing here is obviously your substantive changes, which would be, let's say, changing how you're going to take in a donation or something along those lines. Those would have to be passed through your governing authority. So again, sticking to that timeline and that plan helps too, because it helps ingrain your governing authority that this is an important document, this is something you review annually, you've got a schedule in line. And when you do pass those changes through, just a note to, because these are people that have to read and go through a lot, highlight or somehow or another show them the changes so they're not thinking they have to read through two what look like identical documents. You make it a little easier for them, you might actually increase your chances of getting something sort of approved. If you make it clear to them that you're just changing this policy to this, even though you're giving them the entire thing. And then I think the last thing that I wanted to mention is that ensuring that all digital and hard copies correspond with each other. This can be a bear sometimes, and that they're labeled accordingly. And which is why I say don't keep sort of this continual running list of minor changes. Just save all this for once a year and have a schedule so that you don't have version 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.99, and then version 2. You can kind of stick to version 1 and 2 and do everything at once. If you want to keep all those other versions, you can, but you don't have to. So I think that was it for me, and I will now pass the mic back to Miriam.
Okay, this is Miriam, and I want to thank Elise LeCompte, Laura Capel, and Ann McCudden. And I want to especially thank Laura because she has not been a participant in C2C. And when we decided that a presentation or at least a brief overview on digitization was critical here, she volunteered to come and is participating in the full day here in South Florida. So thanks a lot, Laura. Let me open up the floor. I think as with our other Q&As, our speakers basically covered in a broad way their topics, and let's see if there are any questions from any of you for any of the three speakers. Does anybody have, I don't think we have questions per se. Does anybody have examples that they think might be useful to provide here? And in actuality, it's no problem if we have a couple of extra minutes for our discussion. I think this speaks to the fact that our speakers have been really clear in their overview, because the overview is certainly what they did. Okay, there's a question for Elise. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, this is Laura Nimmers. I have a question for Elise. I'm curious what the difference is between a repository agreement and a long-term loan agreement.
A repository agreement is usually for almost permanent. So like the Park Service uses 20, 25 years, and then the agreement is reviewed and renewed at that time if they want to. A long-term loan I would consider, first of all, as you know, Laura, most of us don't do those anymore. But a long-term loan, in my mind, would be for a shorter period of time, say, 5 to 10 years, rather than 20 to 25 years.
This is Miriam. I think that's a really good question, and I know it is not, we're not simply splitting hairs here, but my sense is also that inherent in a repository agreement is that you are asking somebody else to take the full responsibilities for the collection, whereas in a loan agreement, you're not giving, I don't want to say giving away rights, but you're not asking the borrower to take responsibility. You are asking them to absolutely take responsibility for the collection. But if, for instance, in a long-term loan agreement, a question came in about reproduction, you'd probably go back to the owner for that question. Whereas in a repository agreement, I think in many cases the person who is holding the collection would then have responsibility for granting that permission or not, as the case may be. So I think that there's some differences, some subtle differences there as well in how those are perceived. I see that there's a comment. So this is a question for Laura. Do you include your long-range preservation plan in your digitization collection development policy? Well, that's a good question. I'm going to hand the mic over to Laura.
Hi. At the moment, we don't have our digital preservation plan as part of our collection development policy, largely because we're still working on finalizing our digital preservation plan. But definitely that would be a good element to include, because you go through, it takes such a significant amount of resources and time and staff involvement to create all of these digital resources, and you want to make sure that you protect that investment and that you have planned for how you want to preserve these digital images over the long time.
Okay, I'm going to do a call out for any additional questions.
Miriam, this is Elise. I just wanted to comment on your comment about the repository agreements. You are completely correct. The repository takes on the responsibility of caring for the collection in every way, shape, or form that they would for their own collections. Most of the time, they do not have to go back to the depositing institution to ask permission to do things like put it on exhibit, like loan it, make reproductions, and so on. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a really important difference, even down to the point if it's agreeable to, as I said, accession it into your own system, as long as you do make it clear that you don't legally own it. I see that there's another question. Do we get funding as repositories? Most repositories do get funding in some way, even if it's just an initial fee to take in the collection. Sometimes long-term expenses are not covered, but that's up to the repository if they want to take on that responsibility, if they're able to. But most agreements come with some kind of structure that lasts throughout the terms of the agreement. An initial fee, a fee for upkeep and maintenance, a periodic fee. But again, that's agreed upon between the two institutions on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks so much, Elise. That was a good clarification, and it's nice to know that the person who's taking responsibility for the collection typically does receive some remuneration to help cover the expenses.